Recording in progress.
All right,
Clap for you guys.
fine by me. Okay, good morning. Today we're going to go over the seller counter offer. This seems like a straightforward document, but there's actually some things in it that I want to point out that are often missed or maybe not understood. It's kind of neat how they have changed it. I mean, they changed it a while ago, but we don't ever talk about this. So we're going to talk about it today. Okay. Maybe. It always says that. Okay. Did you know appraisal gaps can actually be addressed directly in the RPA, and then they would automatically adjust in the seller counteroffer with having to write anything into the other terms section. So I'll go into more detail on that in a second. All right, and then the second one, did you know if the arbitration and liquidated damages sections are missing any initials in the RPA, the seller counteroffer automatically corrects them or excludes them. And I'll go over that in detail as well. But those are two things that don't get talked about a lot in a counteroffer. All right, first things first, make sure that the type of counteroffer and the number is correct. What do I mean by that? Okay, so notice at the top it says seller counteroffer number. It is possible that you're going to have multiple counter offers. So you need to be paying attention when you're writing this, that you are countering on number one, if it's your first counter directly to the purchase agreement. Or if you have several back and forths, you need to make sure you're going in order with your counter offers so they all stay in line and in the train, I like to call it, or the chain. The second thing to pay attention to is that it says right underneath, may not be used as a multiple counter offer. Okay, what does that mean? Well, if you have multiple offers on your listing and you want to counter several of them at the same time, you're going to use a different document. You're going to use the seller multiple counter offer, SMCO. And that one gives you flexibility for the seller to then choose which one they want to go with. It doesn't automatically bind them into an agreement if a buyer should agree to that counteroffer. So for this class, we're not multiple countering people. We only got one offer and we are countering on the seller counteroffer. And this is our first one, so it would be number one right here on this blank. And then of course, the date is the date that you're preparing the document. Okay, you're going to notice that it says this is a counter offer to the purchase agreement. That's the standard. If, however, we're continuing on in our chain of back and forth negotiations and we're countering a buyer offer, we have to make sure we check this box, buyer counter offer, and we put the correct number in there as well. If it's counter offer 3, we need to make sure we put number 3 in there. And then the next thing we have to pay attention to is the date. This date right here is not the date you're completing this form. It's not the date the offer was written. It's the date of the document you are countering. So if it is the first counteroffer, you're going to be writing the date that the purchase agreement was dated, not when something was signed on the purchase agreement. It's the date that it was filled out, and that's at the very top of the purchase agreement, okay, the top left-hand side. If it's a buyer counteroffer, and this is going to be seller counter number 2, you're going to put the date that that buyer counter offer was created, not when it was signed, when it was created. So it would be that date up here on the buyer counter offer. Okay, and then obviously you're going to have the address and the buyer and the seller's names. Okay, any questions on when to use a seller multiple counter or a regular counter offer? No? Okay. All right, next up, seller counteroffer section 1A and B. Okay, the terms. The terms and conditions of the above reference document are accepted subject to the following. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, the the above referenced document. Remember, are we countering to the purchase agreement? Are we countering to a buyer counteroffer? So we are accepting whatever that is with the following changes. So if you do not like a term that is in that purchase agreement, you are going to change it, that specific term. But everything else, if you don't discuss it or change it in this counteroffer, you are agreeing to it. Okay, so A, the liquidated damages and arbitration of disputes paragraphs in the offer each require initials by all parties. Okay, I have done a screenshot here of the RPA, those two sections. It's 26 and 28. They're both on page 14 of the RPA. When you send this out digitally, it gives your seller or buyer the option to not initial there. It's not a required area. It's something that they have to agree to. So oftentimes one party will initial these and the other party will not. And then it comes back to compliance and we have to say, you need to give us an amendment stating whether or not liquidated damages and arbitration is part of this contract before we move forward. Okay, so this kept happening a lot, and so they decided to write this into the seller counter offer. So if you counter, it states right here that if either of those paragraphs is not initialed by all parties, that paragraph is now excluded from the final agreement unless specifically referenced for inclusion in paragraph 1D, that's other terms of this counteroffer we'll get to in a second, of this or another counteroffer. So if you notice that the seller missed an initial and they actually do want liquidated damages to be part of it, you're going to have to write in liquidated damages is part of this contract. Okay, otherwise the standard is going to default to it is excluded because they were not completely initialed by both parties in the purchase agreement. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. B,
I have
unless otherwise, yeah, go ahead.
I just have a question. You're probably going to get to it, but many times on contracts over the years, it's been a fairly common practice um, that usually everybody signs liquidated damages. Buyers and sellers are usually in agreement.
Yeah. Is that a question? Sorry, I think you cut out.
There's
Okay. Yeah, so I hear you now. Go
so
ahead.
okay, sorry. So many times the practice has usually been over the years that sellers and buyers normally agree to liquidated damages. However, either party usually doesn't always agree to the arbitration simply because arbitration is binding and there's not an opportunity for appeal by either party should it go against them. What I'm seeing more of these days because of the electronic signatures is that they're automatically initialing the liquidated damages and the arbitration. In your explanation, if one party um, decides that they don't want the arbitration, even though the other party has already signed on the RPA, both sections of liquidated damages and arbitration, is this a way to remedy that?
Yes, but it would be, well, obviously, okay, so let's say the buyer did initial it
Hmm.
and your seller doesn't want to. If your seller leaves it blank and you're counter offering, it will automatically exclude it from the contract. If you're not counter offering and you want to accept it, but they do not want to, the seller does not want to initial it, you're going to have to do an amendment stating that it is excluded to clear up any confusion.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. And then if they both initialed and they realized it was a mistake, you can always do an amendment again, excluding it. Okay. And all right. where was I? Okay, unless otherwise agreed or altered in another counteroffer, the down payment and the loan amount will be adjusted in the same proportion as in the original offer. But the dollar amount of any initial and increased deposit and seller credits shall remain unchanged from the original offer. Okay, so that means if the buyer is putting down 3.5% of the purchase price and you increase the purchase price on the seller counteroffer, that 3.5% will automatically be adjusted. So they're putting down 3.5% no matter what purchase price it is. Now, it also states that the initial earnest money deposit will not change. So that whatever is in the initial earnest money deposit will stay the same unless you counter it out to increase it. Okay, that makes sense? All right. Moving on, appraisal gap. This is one that I actually, when I first saw this change to the RPA, I didn't understand it. I was like, what? Why the heck would they do that? Like, dummy. I thought, okay, it says, this is in RPA 3L, so it's in the grid on page 2 when it's talking about the appraisal contingencies. And it states appraisal contingency based upon appraised value at a minimum of purchase price or, and you can write amount in there. Dummy me, thought at first, well, if we're at $399 and we put $380 there, does that mean they can walk away if it doesn't, appraise at $380? I thought it was the opposite of what it actually meant. It actually means that the appraisal must come in below whatever amount they write in there. So if they wrote $380 in there, they are on the hook to still buy this house at $399. That creates that appraisal gap. So I know a lot of times you write it in other terms and we state like appraisal gap. In the event it doesn't appraise for blah, 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 whatever, we make our own terms. Right, right. So they actually put that in here. And you can, if this is obviously going to be on the buyer side because they filled this out originally. And again, in my example, if the purchase price is $399, they put $380 in there. That buyer is stating they have that appraisal gap in there.
So what would the best practice be?
Best practice for the buyer, if you want to have an appraisal gap, and let's say they have $10,000 to play with, then you don't mark anything in here.
So if you leave it blank,
It's going to be the purchase price, like normal.
So let's say they're willing, in your example, the list price is $399. Let's say
We're gonna need
they're
you a
willing to
microphone.
they're willing to pay $5,000 over that, so they're willing to pay $404 for the property. You would write $404 there?
You would write $404 as your purchase price.
I would write $404 as my purchase price,
Uh-huh.
and then I would put
And it,
$399.
yes, because if you
That's
think it
space.
might not appraise for $399 or for $405, you think it's probably going to appraise for $399, and your buyer has that extra cash, you would put that lower amount in there. Yeah. Or if, let's say there's, your buyer has 10 grand to play with for an appraisal gap, you're going to put it 10 grand lower than your offer price in that box. And then that ties them into that.
So they're saying.
Amount
I'm
of
willing to
gap.
pay- In my example with the $5,000 gap, they're willing to pay $404 as long as it appraises.
They're willing to pay $404 and
If it appraises at let's say it appraises at 4,
mhm,
then they are still obligated to pay $404 for it.
Yes.
Bringing in that extra $4,000.
yes, if you have written that into this section as the appraisal gap.
whatever.
Yeah, so you're gonna put your purchase price, what your buyer wants to write on, $405,000.
Page 1. We're on page
Yes,
one,
on page 1, yes, on the purchase price amount, that is, you're writing your offer, we're gonna pay $405,000. We have $5,000 to play with if it doesn't come in at 405, so I'm gonna write 400 in this box on L2. And that makes sure that my buyer, if it does appraise for 400, they are still paying 405 because they have that $5,000. If it appraises at 395, then you'd go back to negotiating, but they've still got a $5,000 gap. I know it's confusing. It confused me at first too.
Sticky, once they see what it appraises at, then they don't wanna pay what they're. what
Yeah,
you
so,
For.
but just like we have all dealt with when it's in a seller's market and we're in multiple offer situations, our buyers are gonna fully understand that they might be paying more than what it appraises for because they want that house.
Just that we're not writing it out in a.
Yeah.
In an appraisal.
Yeah,
comment.
so, and this is yeah, we used to write this in other terms. We used to write our own verbiage and it would get really confusing. Okay, so if this is an option that they have written into the contract, when you're on the buying side, you can put your appraisal gap right here. And then the counter offer discusses this as well. So just like the loan amount before the down payment stays at 3.5%, no matter what the price fluctuates to, this appraisal gap will stay the same. And that's what section 1C talks about. And it gives an example, and I have another one here. So if the purchase price is $500,000, the buyer lowered their appraisal contingency to 480, we have a $20,000 gap. Okay, so let's say we're gonna counter and we actually want 550 for the house. That appraisal gap doesn't go all the way to $50,000. It stays right at that 20, adjusting that to $530,000. Okay, so whatever that amount of gap is, whatever that gap is, that's it. In our market, it's gonna be 5,000 or 10,000. What?
That takes care of like not to exceed the purchase price.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
You're using $10,000 over appraised value, but not.
Right. Now, you're still gonna have to write in that verbiage if the buyer didn't originally check this box in L2. You still have to address it. If you are countering as a listing agent and think it's not gonna appraise for the price, you're gonna need to address that on your own in other terms. Okay, so this is just something to be aware of. If you get the offer and there's a number written in L2, that's how we understand it. They're giving us a gap amount. Okay, and then when we counter, even if we raise the purchase price, that gap amount stays at that $10,000. It doesn't stay to the lower dollar amount in L2.
Jessica, I have a
probably-
We're
question.
gonna be talking, but we have.
Yeah, go ahead.
Jessica, I have a question. So if I'm understanding this correctly, and I think where perhaps some of the confusion might come in is that L2, whatever amount you're putting in there, if that box is checked, is essentially establishing the difference between whatever the purchase price is and the appraisal price. So it's not really setting a minimum purchase price. It's essentially setting a gap minimum. Is
Yes,
that correct?
setting a dollar amount. We got to do some math. So, right,
Right.
if
Okay.
it's 405 and we put 400 in there, the math is we've created a $5,000 gap. That $5,000 gap continues on if we raise the purchase price in the counter, it's still only $5,000. The
Okay.
dollar amounts.
So it's
Yeah.
actually establishing the difference between whatever that gap is. It's the price difference, not a minimum purchase price.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Any other clarity needed on this appraisal gap section?
Could you give an example of if the seller counters at 410, we're at 405 with 400
Yeah, yes.
here,
Okay.
and the seller's gonna counter us at 410.
Okay, so Barb's example is our purchase price that we wrote on the very top of the purchase agreement is $405,000. On L2, we checked that box and we wrote in $400,000, which gives us a $5,000 appraisal gap. Okay, now we're countering back as the seller and we're asking for $410,000. If the buyer agrees to that, they are still agreeing to only a $5,000 appraisal gap. So the appraisal would have to come in at 405 to continue to obligate them to continue forward. If it came in less than that, it would give them the right to cancel for the appraisal contingency or to renegotiate the purchase price with the seller at that point. Did I say that correctly? I'm doing math in my head. Okay. Any other questions on that?
I got a question, but I'll ask you after we're done.
Okay. Irma?
As a seller.
Mm-hmm.
Wait a second, let me get this. So we're all in here.
It is confusing, yeah.
So the seller countered, shouldn't the seller have written the amount of the gap?
Only if you want the gap to be larger.
Okay.
This is on purchase agreement.
Yeah, so the buyer,
If urban seller counters me at 410, but wants me to cover a $10,000 gap.
you would
I
have,
would have to
yes.
address that.
So back into our last example, if the seller countered to 410 and we wanted them to have a larger gap to 400, we would have to address that and ask for it to be larger.
Okay.
If we leave it alone, it's the standard of that 5,000 that was written in there. It follows it.
And to keep it clear as mud, I would just say, paragraph blah, blah, blah is changed to this.
Correct, you could do that. That would
Versus
actually make it
like
easier.
verbiage.
Yes, so this is what Barb said is a good example, or Ashley, it's a good way to do it. Instead of trying to come up with your own verbiage, you would just reference back to the RPA. You would say RPA section 3L2 to B, and then you would put 400,000. Okay, that,
We should always use.
Yeah, to remain-
Trying to use our words to.
yes, so,
put this out.
yes. And Barb said we should always reference back to the contract if we can, instead of trying to use our own words, because our words are not as good as the lawyers that wrote these. Okay?
Word
It's a very good
question.
point.
Is it
Yeah.
possible to use, to utilize both because this is somewhat confusing, to establish the gap, but then also, in other terms, establish a minimum purchase price, if it should happen to fall below that?
I
appraisal
think that
comes
just
in-
makes
The
everybody
appraisal comes
confused. I
in,
think,
let's say, for example, on this example, the 405 is the purchase price. They've put in here, 400. We counter at 410. Then that automatically increases this to 405. Is that according?
yes,
Okay, and let's say that the seller is not willing to take anything less than 400, and it somehow appraises at 395. Is it possible to establish that minimum purchase price at 400?
That's back to.
And that might be a bad
yeah, you're
example with
gonna
the
have to
numbers.
renegotiate with them at that point. I think the easiest, cleanest way is to counter RPA 3L2 at the amount that creates
Of the
the
difference.
best gap that your seller wants,
Okay,
and see if
Okay,
they
thank you.
agree to that.
okay,
And
thank
it will depend on if the buyer has the extra cash.
And
if
if
they
the
can even
price
agree
is
to it.
low, you're just back to
Yeah,
negotiate.
and if it praises a lot less than that, then it's back to a negotiation on your seller's part. And sometimes sellers don't get what they want for the house. So at that point, it's either they cancel and don't sell anymore, or they take less. I know. You don't get what you want. You get what you get, don't throw a fit, right?
There you go.
Okay, moving on. Section 1D and E. Section D is the other terms. This is where you're gonna write in your listing specific counter that you're gonna counter out. And that can be a myriad of things. And then section E are the additional boxes to check for any other addendums or contracts that you want to include in this. So instead of just writing seller to stay in possession for 5 days at $0, no, you're gonna just check seller in possession on section E, and you're gonna fill out that form correctly. And by checking the box in the seller counteroffer, it automatically ties it to the offer because it is checked. You don't need to rewrite it in the other terms. Okay, and there's a list of them there that you can, you know, if it's a backup offer, you would attach that. A myriad of different things that could come up. And then there's, of course, the other box if it's something else that they don't have listed. I think they're pretty good at including everything that could possibly be attached, but you never know.
So the other terms would be like, if there was something excluded that wasn't excluded on the contract, if there was something excluded on the listing side, so the seller says, I'm taking my potted plants. And
Yeah.
the buyer's offer came over and it did not exclude the potted plants. I would then be able to use other terms to say excluded from the RPA.
Right. Yes. So other terms are things you want to make sure you're excluding, maybe things that you want to make sure are included because they don't want to take. Or you're going to change the purchase price here. You would change the amount of compensation that the seller is willing to pay the buyer agent. That would be addressed in other terms. But if it's something that has its own document, like a backup offer or a seller in possession, you're just going to check the box and fill out that form correctly. Okay. And if your seller wants it to be written exactly in the other terms as well, that's fine. It's not going to hurt anything. But you definitely need to check the box to make sure that that addendum is part of the contract. Okay, and if I see seller in possession for 9 days in other terms and you haven't checked the box for the SIP and you didn't put it in your file, I'm going to be rejecting it and saying you need a SIP. Okay. All right, expiration. So 3 days after delivery, your seller's going to sign this. You're going to give it back to the buyer side. As soon as it hits that buyer agent's email, that's the date of delivery. 3 days after that, at 5 p.m. on that third day, is when this expires. Now, what happens if you haven't heard back from the buyer yet and your seller goes, oh, wait a minute, I actually wanted to change this part of the counter? You can do B, you can withdraw on the WOO form, the WOO, and redo a new one. Or if another buyer comes in and has a better offer and you accept that, your seller can accept another offer if this one hasn't come back from the buyer yet within that expiration time. They give you 2 options here. You can just accept the other buyer counter and then this makes this one void, or you can go ahead and send a withdrawal of offer, which is the best practice. You need to send the WOO out to this one stating we've accepted an offer already from someone else. That clears it up. Okay. And then marketing to other buyers, it's very clear here to the buyer that the seller still has the right to continue to offer their offer their home for sale active on the market until it is under contract. Just because you're in negotiations, that's why a buyer needs to hurry up and go back and forth, and because they could lose out. All right, signing and acceptance. Time is of the essence, yes. Yeah, you have the 3 days, but you might not want to wait the 3 days and depending on the market. Okay, signing and acceptance. So this is a section that I see often signed incorrectly. Okay, so I want to explain exactly why there's a late acceptance box. When you send this to your seller to sign, they're not signing in 4 and 6 at the same time. Okay, they're just signing number 4. This is them signing that they are going to be countering the buyer with the above terms. Then it goes back to the buyer, and buyer is going to sign in number 5. Okay, if they sign it to accept it, you are good to go. If it is within that 3-day period, or if you've changed the date and time for expiration, let's say they had 24 hours. If it's within that time period, it is an accepted offer at that point. If the buyer gets it back to you after that period has expired, the seller then has to sign on section 6, the late acceptance, stating, yes, we still do accept this offer. So notice that it says, if the date of the buyer's signature in paragraph 5 is after the expiration specified in paragraph 2A, that was the slide before, buyer's acceptance is only binding if seller agrees to the late acceptance by signing below. Okay, so if the buyer gets it back to you signed after the expiration, you do not have a binding contract because it had expired. And now in the past, we had to do an amendment stating expiration date extended to blah, 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 and that would make it a binding contract. Now they got smart and gave us a line that the seller can sign saying, yes, we still want to move forward with this offer. Yes, Irma.
If you don't have a counter, if you have a purchase contract out,
And now the contract comes back signed by the buyer after the 3 days.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a form for that?
It's just going to be an amendment.
Is that I'm sorry, I was outside. Is that a counteroffer or is that the RPA?
This up on the screen is the counter offer. Mhm.
Sorry. I'll
Yeah.
sign in the corner.
And the buyer counter offer has this exact same thing as well. So if you get a buyer counter offer and the seller takes too long, then the buyer will again have to accept it after expiration. Okay, that is it for our detailed seller counter. You thought it was this tiny, simple form, but it actually has quite a bit in there. Any questions at all related to the seller counter offer?
I got a stupid question.
Okay, let's get you the microphone,
Not
Vince.
full of questions, but, so, you know, like how the FHA mandatory clause, stipulates that it needs to appraise for this amount, right?
Yes.
Usually the sales price, that doesn't supersede anything in a.
It does. FHA and VA will supersede it and cancel out any gap.
Okay, and it wasn't too stupid.
It
of a
wasn't.
question.
No,
Okay,
so-
thank you, good
Mhm.
job.
so basically they can't do a gap.
Yeah, I mean, they can.
can.
They
but
can
not-
agree to it, but if they decide they don't want to, then
They
their
can-
FHA and VA will
They can get
supersede
out.
that gap. They can get out.
So even if they wrote in the contract that they were willing to do the gap,
Mhm.
that the FHA mandatory clause can.
It can supersede it. It doesn't mean it will. That buyer can still give the gap and move forward. It's just if they decide they don't want to anymore, that gives them an out.
Good to know. Thank you,
Yeah.
Jessica. That's worth the price of admission.
Yeah,
Well,
Okay.
I wouldn't not accept a VA or FHA. This is actually, as you know, I'm a veteran.
yes,
I'm a veterans border, my husband's a vet, my family's a vet.
same.
I would not accept a VA thinking that because under their, what do you always say, it, good faith,
Right.
they're probably, you're already told them that they can back out. Based on that all the time. But I would never feel like they're doing that on purpose. I would never tell them they could. Like,
Right.
say, look, this is what you can, but good faith shows you're doing this.
Right. And if they understand
Please don't
enough,
back out just because
Yeah.
you think you can, because that's my reputation too.
yeah,
And don't do that.
if they're, with it enough, they're gonna understand what the gap means. They're gonna know that they have that extra funds. They want the house bad enough to put that gap in there. They wouldn't just use that as their get out of jail free card.
And
They could.
a lot of people think that just because they're using a VA loan, they don't have money. Some of the
Right.
richest people I know
Yeah.
are veterans.
Mhm.
They have money.
Yeah, it's just
They get this amazing benefit because of
Totally.
their service to our country.
Yep.
So if anybody online wants to come up.
Yeah. Anybody have any questions online? Anything in the chat? I'm not seeing anything. Chat.
I have one quick question, Jessica.
Yeah, go ahead, Myron.
First of all, thank you. You always do a fantastic job on explaining these things that
Thanks.
we always seem to not pay that much attention to. So thank you for that. And in regarding the appraisal gap, it's made me think that if you have multiple offers and an appraisal doesn't come in, comes in below, um, is the next offer and the buyer backs out, is the next offer that you go to bound to that appraisal, or they have to get their own appraisal and it's kind of like starting from scratch?
That would depend on the type of loan. So the FHA appraisal will follow the house for, was it 3? Okay, between 3 and 6 months, depending on, I don't know what.
But if it's conventional, then that's
If it's
doesn't.
conventional, then they would get their own appraisal.
Okay.
Yeah, and it could be
Okay.
different.
Thank you.
VA gets a new one too, according to Barb. Or why do I call you Barb today? You guys are one and the same, apparently.
The barbs.
Okay, good question. All right. If no one else has anything, then that's it for today.
Thank you, Jessica.
Of
Yay.
course.
Katie says thank you.
All right, awesome.
Somebody